Welcome again to the Forum Book Club. This week we begin discussing The Next Pope, the book The Next Pope by George Weigel, The Office of Peter and a Church in Mission. So I have a couple of questions we can perhaps begin with. First of all, what does it mean to write a book on the next pope? Well, you still have a pope, possibly even two popes that are still living. And two, who is qualified to write such a book? And three, why would anybody be interested in such a book?
Are they rhetorical questions, or are they questions for the other two members of the triumvirate?
Those are real questions.
Well, I would suggest, obviously, that without getting involved in any ecclesial politics, that the times in which we're living are such that the next pope is going to obviously be heading the church at a time of increasing probable persecution, at least in the decadent West, and the challenge with modernity and modernism, and how that plays itself out, and whether we have a pope that's courageous enough to call for witness, including, if necessary, in the full meaning of that word.
So we're writing this book for the cardinals who will elect the next pope. Is that it? I mean, what good does it do for you or me to read a book like this? Vivian, I see you shaking your head.
This book is doing me a great deal of good because George Weigel does an excellent job in such a slim volume. He's doing such an excellent job of putting into good context the Vatican Council, the conciliar popes, the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict, and what they tried to accomplish. I think this is very timely to help lay people also understand the mission of the church in the present time and the roles of the council and the recent popes in that.
Could I continue the noble tradition we've had in the Forum Book Club of playing good cop, bad cop with you? I think this is an excellent book. I'm really pleased because I was a bit confused by the first chapter. And I think that most of my concerns about the first chapter were actually assuaged by, quite frankly, George Weigel, I would even be tempted to say, contradicting himself. In other words, the first chapter, it's all about seeing history, I would say, myopically. In other words, you don't see the Council of Trent, you don't see history through the eyes of the Council of Trent, you see the Council of Trent through the lens of history. And same thing with the Second Vatican Council. And I think that we're too close to it. And he says this later on. He says later on, we should not judge a council till centuries from now. But if that's the case, we should be very careful about seeing the whole of history through the lens of that council. And I would prefer that, it's very interesting at the beginning, we talked about 5 epochs. But I think, looking at the longer telescopic view of history, it would be fair to say the most recent epoch is not the new evangelization because of Vatican II, but the counter-revolutionary church subsequent to the French Revolution, which is still going on because the war the church is facing at the moment is a war with secular humanism, which we can say sort of began maybe further back, but it's definitively perhaps with the French Revolution. And I think that is what we're still in. And the Vatican II is part of that, but it's not the epoch-changing moment, I would suggest. And I would also suggest it's too close to us to know that one way or the other.
Okay, well, I want to continue this because this is a fascinating line of discussion. But first of all, to kind of put this little summation in there, and I think Vivian is saying this book is not a book of lobbying for the next pope. That's not its importance, but rather showing the situation of the church in the present era. And then with that, Joseph, you've got some critique, so to speak, of how he divides things, how he looks at things. Let's go into that a little bit more. I'm sure, Joseph, you must have thought of the famous chapter in Everlasting Man called The 5 Deaths of the Faith, in which Chesterton recalls how Christianity absorbed the culture, became one with the culture, and when the culture declined, the church didn't go with it. The church rose again. The 5 periods which Weigel presents here are not the same as the 5 deaths of the faith that Chesson presents, but the last 2 are, in a sense. I mean, certainly everyone agrees that the passage from medieval Christianity to a divided Christendom was a major historical moment in the church. But Weigel kind of characterizes the post-Reformation Church of the Council of Trent as, he has on page 21 here, I'll quote his little thing here, the sometimes brackish, seemingly safe waters of institutional management. That's the period he's characterizing as prior to the new evangelization. But, you know, I grew up in those brackish waters, and maybe this isn't a good testimony, but I saw great vitality in the church of the 19th century, the early 20th century, missionary, new religious orders, vocation of the priesthood, large families, really.
Yeah, by the way, I'm agreeing with you. Page 17, he says the Counter-Reformation was over and that the Holy Spirit was calling the church beyond self-maintenance. Now, to sort of juxtapose the Counter-Reformation with self-maintenance strikes me as being an oversimplistic way of seeing things. I mean, I see the Counter-Reformation in some sense as a Catholic Reformation. I mean, all sorts of glorious things were happening in the church in the 16th and 17th century, which revitalized the church as a response to the Protestant rupture. But you know, this sort of seeing the Counter-Reformation church as something which is sort of insular, fortress mentality, and there's nothing wrong with that up to a point. But of course, we have to evangelize. But that's that's not all that it is. And I think it's too simplistic, especially if you're going to say we had the Counter-Reformation church up until, and even that changes because he says at the beginning he sort of begins it with Leo the 13th. But you know, so I have a problem with all of this because you know that what's that saying about the popes before that? And then, but what I would like to say though, that most of my concerns that I highlighted in the first chapter are assuaged. Because he actually, I'll say, contradicts himself, but he talks about Pius the IX in very positive terms. He talks about the fact that the Counter-Reformation Church went out and evangelized the world. I mean, what was the greatest missionary activity in the history of the church? You know, was basically during the Counter-Reformation. But he says all this later on. So it seems to me that the first chapter should have been rewritten in the light of the rest of it. That's really what I'm saying.
I'm leaving a pause for Vivian here. I don't know.
Well,
you don't have to speak,
so.
but I mean,
maybe so. But I appreciate very much, given what I'm hearing on a lot of chatter. I appreciate very much his explaining the purpose of the Second Vatican Council. The role played by Pope John Paul II, his role in the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, page 9, the fact that Ratzinger was a peritus and was influential in developing 5 conciliar texts, that the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI could be understood as a single 35-year effort to give the council an authoritative interpretation as opposed to, you know, one in communion rather than rupture. And I think right now, a lot of this in the current arguments I'm hearing and trying to stay out of, a lot of this has been overlooked. A lot of people haven't even read the council documents. And are chiming in on it being a disaster and so on. I really appreciated these early chapters. I don't see. I think you're right, Joseph. We always have to be careful that we're not judging the past by the current times. You know, and he does say, as you point out, he says it actually rather early on that. The right question is not whether the council was a good idea. That won't be answered for decades from now.
Or centuries, he said that.
Or centuries. However, the real question of, do we see this, oh shucks, I can't find the page now. Do we see this in continuity in the proper way, because I see those wherever they are on the spectrum, if they're arguing that the church if the Vatican Council is a rupture, and that's why
I'm not arguing that, and I have no objection at all, Vivian, with anything you said about JP2 and Benedict XVI and the Council. They aren't the parts of that first chapter that I'm querying. Let me give you an example. Though, page 15. It says the church must recenter its self-understanding on Jesus Christ. Well, I was not aware that the church had ever lost its understanding of itself as being centered on Jesus and Christ. Jesus Christ. And he says a few lines below that, middle of page 15, the era of what might be called ecclesiocentricity needs to give way for a new era of Christocentricity. I mean, since when has the church believed that the church itself or herself was separate from the mystical body of Jesus Christ? Then he says that was the direction in which the Holy Spirit had been leading the church for almost a century. So in other words, somehow or other, the church of the Counter-Reformation, which is the epoch that immediately precedes it, was ecclesiocentric at the expense of being Christocentric. I think that's a schizophrenic understanding of ecclesiology.
Well, over the years, I'm at the tail end of the baby boom, the very tail end, born in 1959. And a lot of and I'm a convert, like you, Joseph, and a lot of the born and raised in the Catholic Church baby boomers I have met in the course of my adult life, it was amazing to me that in spite of Catholic education, in spite of being from a large family, in spite of being taken to church every Sunday and so on, it would amaze me how the centrality of their relationship with Christ somehow was never part of what they experienced in the way they were raised in the faith. And when you would say something like that, they would say, well, that's Protestant, right? A relationship with Christ.
No, and I agree with that, but you can't honestly say that Catholic education has improved since the Council. I'm not blaming the Council for it.
No.
But you can't say that things have got much better because of the evangelization. I know you're not.
I'm not saying that at all, that things got better with I'm not saying, no. I'm not saying that. I'm pointing to this era that these people were raised, which was before the Council, that if you talked about a relationship with Christ as a new zealous Catholic coming into the church and wanting to share my Christian faith in Jesus, now brought to its full maturity in the sacramental life of the church. And how many times that's Protestantism, talking about a relationship with Christ.
I think
and reading the Bible and all this. Anyway, I'm only saying that I'm not denying that the church's self-understanding has changed, but how people experience the church prior to the Council, I sense that the Council Fathers did have reasons for the Council, whether it was the liturgy or evangelization. And that's not to say that what happened since then has all been great. Not at all. But anyway.
Right. But I think, at least from our perspective, and I'll link in England and the United States as Western European, North American Catholics in the mid-20th century, I mean, partly is a victim of our own success. I mean, you get large families, you get people going to church, you get a lot more priests, you have the institutions became enormous. The public school, the Catholic schools were incredible, Catholic hospitals, all these things. Well, when you get that big of a thing with that many people, as opposed to, say, evangelical Protestant, you don't go to church unless you love Jesus and want to go to church. You don't go to church because everybody's doing it, So
right.
I think there was a kind of an emphasis on the church as church, and maybe that led to an overshadowing sometimes of the personal relation to Jesus. Although, when you think of all the vocations, I mean, these people didn't leave their lives to become nuns and priests to join an institution. I mean, there was some kind of a personal direct call that they experienced.
And I would like to move on because the rest of the book's great. This was just a quibble, and I don't want the quibble to take up half of our discussion on the whole thing. But I would say about new evangelization that when I was doing my research for literary converts, in the 1930s in England, there were tens of thousands of adult converts to the Catholic faith. Now that wave broke, and it broke after World War II. So I'm not blaming the council, right? But the point is, that what I would suggest is we can't talk about evangelization being a new idea, the new evangelization which wasn't around prior to World War II, for instance, because clearly that's not the case.
Well, a couple of things. I want to, Vivian, you were looking for the quote. It was on page 36, new paragraph there in the middle. The most important debate in the Catholic Church in the third decade of the 21st century is not the argument over whether the Second Vatican Council was a wise idea or a foolish idea. Skipping a few, the next paragraph, the most important debate in the Catholic Church today is one that began during the last 2 centuries of the Council that has continued ever since. The debate over whether Vatican II was a council in continuity, revelation and tradition, or a council of rupture and discontinuity in which the Church essentially reinvented itself. So he sees that as a debate. But I want to go back to what you said at the very beginning, Joseph. You expressed it as the needs for the next pope are related to the fact that we are still trying to overcome the French Revolution and what happened as a result of that. Is that compatible or congruent with this idea that we're trying to make sure we interpret the council correctly?
Well, I would argue if we're going to see things in epochs, I know it is but myopia. You can't really judge what's happened in the last 50 years in terms of the telescopic understanding of history. That's what when he says on page 36, that debate can only be engaged seriously several hundred years from now. So that's what I'm saying. Most of my concerns he answers himself subsequently. But I would say that epoch would be that the Counter-Reformation Church became, in 1789, the Counter-Revolutionary Church, where the enemy is no longer Protestant heresy, but secular fundamentalism. And I think that's been secular humanism, if you prefer. And I think that's been what the church has been addressing and struggling with and witnessing against for the last 200 years.
And I would add, did you see how German historicism made its way into this book?
Yes.
On page 33. So he's talking about the Enlightenment of the 19th century, Catholic communities, especially in the German-speaking lands whose liberal Protestant neighbors long ago bade farewell to the notion of divine revelation that is binding over time. And so what's been so critical about the times we're living in is that this debate, Joseph, that you rightly called the argument with the revolution, has been going on inside the church. So the enemy is us.
I would always, and I've done this many times, in this book club, always distinguish between the human element of the church and the church as the mystical body of Christ. And just to remind ourselves that the church triumphant is a lot larger than the church militant, and we should see we in relationship to that bigger picture of what the Catholic Church is.
Let me try something out here. Not as actually a thesis, but as an opinion, that one of the things which resulted from the French Revolution and then this German historicism in the 19th century was movement towards radical autonomy, the self and self-will as being the principle of happiness and so on, and that the Catholic Church had resisted that pretty well in the Counter-Reformation and the Counter-Revolution time. But after the council, with the attempt to revitalize or make more Christocentric the Catholic faith, there was, not necessarily because of the council or the council itself doing this, but there was an accommodation to this personal freedom and autonomy with the sexual revolution especially, that now it's made it even more important to interpret the council properly and continue to fight against this radical autonomy.
Yes.
Yeah, and we do need to distinguish, as we always have, and obviously in this book club we always have and will do, between Vatican II and the so-called Spirit of Vatican II. There was certainly something really weird happening in the world in the 1960s, and I've never read any study yet which satisfactorily grapples with it for me. But the whole world, sorry, no, not the whole world, the whole Western world became besotted with the idea of radical autonomy and sexual liberation. And a time of absolute blind, bland, and ridiculous optimism, 15 years after the dropping of the nuclear bomb and 2 world wars, as if all of a sudden we're now living in a new Eden. I don't know where it came from, or perhaps I do, but obviously wasn't a something which only affected the church. It'd be the other way around, really. I think it was very much a worldly thing that somehow had infected the spirit of Vatican.
Yes. I agree. And his chapter on the next Pope and Christian humanism, he talks about the need to persist in the proper anthropology and the proper understanding of freedom. It reminded me of our last topic of conversation with Bob Riley's book. On page 72, in the middle of the page, he writes, "Freedom detached from goodness and reduced to choice is infantile. It does not make for happiness or satisfaction. It's also bad for society. For if there is only your choice and my choice, and our choices collide, what happens when neither of us acknowledges that there's something called the good by which we can decide which of our choices is better? What happens is that one of us imposes our power on the other or gets the state to do so. And that is the prescription for tyranny." That was what we talked about in our last book.
Exactly. I mean, it wasn't as if these books were written with respect to each other, but it's interesting. Two people, very, intelligent people with a lot of breadth, are saying the very same thing about this culture.
Which is why I do want to stress that my quibble, and I did want to mention it because I think it's important, but basically all of my fears were assuaged in the subsequent chapters when his analysis, his critique of modernity and of what's happening in the church is so thorough and good. And that one extract you've just read exemplifies that.
Well, this is a great tactic of authors who want to get people to read their books carefully, is to make them upset in the first chapter to quibble, so they'll read more carefully what comes after that.
Well, in that case, George Weigel was brilliant.
And Bob Riley, and Bob Riley too. In that same chapter, I mean, he does on page 69. He mentions these various what we've experienced in the 20th century. Communism and socialism is one view of man. Then consumerism is another view, and then the sexual revolution, which is partly consumerism, but it's again the view of man, the human nature, has been absolutely determinative of what's happening. And I keep going back to that ridiculous decision in Casey versus Planned Parenthood. At the heart of liberty is the right to determine one's own concept of meaning. No. So
I love the way he ended each of those paragraphs you just mentioned, Father, on page 69 with, so when has that happened out? When did that end well? It's kind of a clever rhetorical device.
Right.
So this battle, though, for the true understanding of the human person and human freedom, this battle has been fought in the church itself. And so many people who want to blame on Vatican II itself this dynamic, I don't think the proper locus of blame is the council, but this other thing, Joseph, you just pointed at, what is this other thing that we besotted? What a great word. Drunk with this craziness, to make sure we locate where that really comes from and not situate it in the council fathers like Ratzinger and John Paul II and their pontificate, which tried to keep this anthropology correct against all of this opposition. It puts their pontificates on a level of heroism, really, that even within their own church, their own bosom bishops and so on, that this strife has gone on. Wow, I think Weigel isn't just trying to punch you in the nose to get you to keep reading. I think he is trying to situate the situation. I guess that's redundant.
What I like about the latter part of, obviously we're only looking at the first half of the book here, but the latter half of the first half of the book, in fact, the whole, all of it after that quibbling first chapter, is that, he gave the impression that this was, this Holy Spirit that sort of revisited the church in the last 50 or 100 years. But then, later in the book, he does, it all starts with Leo the 13th, as if prior to that, everything was awry. But then he does pay tribute to the Counter-Reformation. He does pay tribute to Pius IX, which I was pleased to see. He does pay tribute to Pius XI, which I was all very pleased to see. So, in other words, what we get as the book emerges, if you like, is a broadening of its thesis, which is more Catholic with a small c. In other words, we're seeing the current situation in a broader historical context, which is necessary. And I think at the beginning, it was sort of, it looked to me as if it's myopic, as if, the new evangelization was a new idea that came around, the council and then 2000 with the Jubilee and all those things are good, but they need to be seen in the broader context of things.
And I think because we see today going on a very heated and lively debate about the council itself, and there are fairly, high-placed Catholic intellectuals and prelates who say we should drop it from the list. We should forget it. We should ignore it. And of course, Weigel and I take a very different view of that. And one reason he wants to write this book is that John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis were all popes of the council, in the sense that John Paul II and Benedict were there, and Francis was young, a priest when it was going on. But the next pope very likely will not have even been out of high school when the council took place, and therefore it's important.
One thing I would say, I suppose I would, I could be classified, if you want, and I'd be uncomfortable with it as the most skeptical of the three of us, perhaps. But I do think that George Weigel is correct, that there's no real way we'll be able to judge the Second Vatican Council until we're a couple of centuries beyond it. Like the Council of Trent became clearer, after the fallout of the Reformation became, something we look back on and see panoramically. But I'm not skeptical against the council. One thing I would say is I've never yet seen anybody critique, to my satisfaction, anything heretical about the actual documents of the council. You can say all sorts of things that you say allegedly are a consequence of those documents. But the point is, the documents themselves, I've never seen anything in them which that I can see as being problematic from the perspective of orthodoxy and doctrine.
Well, I've got all the text right here in this little book, all in the original Latin. It's a beautiful little book, very fine print. And how many pages in this book? 1,258. So the Vatican Council produced more documents, more, let's call it words, than all the other 19 councils put together. So it was a very wordy council, and that could be part of a problem with it. But as you say, Joseph, you can search through this entire 1,300 pages of documents. There's no clear heresy. There is ambiguity, and there may even be, and likely was, intentional ambiguity there. But how do you solve that? You read the council in the light of tradition. That's how you solve that.
Yes, which it certainly can be done. And Joseph, I find that when people get upset about the council and start going on and on about it with me, the first thing I have to do is this and say, have you read the documents yourself?
Yeah. What it is, we can't, this is not strictly correct. The father rolled his eyes at me because the council is not a man, but in many ways it's an ad hominem attack, right? You look at the consequences in society as a whole and you blame it on the council.
Yes.
Now, unless you can actually show that the council itself is directly responsible because something it taught or said, so that's a non sequitur.
Yes.
And we all know that the Spirit of Vatican II, right, Spirit in inverted commas, was disastrous, but that's not the true Spirit of Vatican II in the sense of what the documents actually say. And that distinction is crucial. And if we don't keep that clear, then we end up, we talk about ad hominem, non sequiturs. We're not actually discussing anything rationally at that point.
Yes, I agree.
And there's a great one-liner on page 37, 2/3 down. The Catholic Church does not do paradigm shifts. That was great.
Right. That must have been a
Jesus was a paradigm
to you,
shift.
Joseph, that wasn't what he was talking about.
Yeah, well, it was very soon after. I mean, it was just that one chapter. After that, I thought, well, this is good, and also, if I want to be, I don't know what the right word is. Well, he's contradicting himself. In other words, he states things in a myopic fashion, then he obviously shows that he's not myopic, right? So I just wish he hadn't. I just wish that first chapter was reworded somewhat differently. That's my only quibble. But as I've read on, so up to halfway through the book now, and it's excellent, and it's what you would expect. And they're quoting Henri de Lubac there and Solzhenitsyn.
Yes.
You can't go far wrong with Solzhenitsyn or de Lubac. So and Christopher Dawson, all on page 66. Shall I read them, Father? Do we have time?
Sure, go ahead.
But this is page 66. So Henri de Lubac says, it is not true, as is sometimes said, that man cannot organize the world without God. What is true is that without God, he can only organize it against man, which is brilliant. I mean, Chesterton has done anything better than that. It's a wonderful paradox. And then 40 years after de Lubac, the Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn made the same point even more succinctly. The disasters of the 20th century, he proposed, had happened because men had forgotten God. And then Christopher Dawson, and I love his description here, ordinarily the mildest of authors, put it in uncharacteristically fierce passage. Quote, a secular society that has no end beyond its own satisfaction is a monstrosity, a cancerous growth that will ultimately destroy itself. When George Weigel brings in the big guns like that to buttress his case, we're in safe hands.
That's right. And Father, though you raised a question in the beginning, who's George Weigel to write a book about the next pope? I mean, it does seem a bit audacious, doesn't it?
Yes.
And so what's your answer to your own question?
Oh, it wasn't rhetorical.
Okay.
Well, I mean, he gives the answer. And as a matter of fact, we asked him to give this answer. When we first got the manuscript, this little first note wasn't there. We said, George, this doesn't look like you are going to you're pontificating now, about
right.
who the pontiff should be. And he said, look, he is someone who really knows the church in contemporary times. He's been on personal terms with these three popes, the last three popes. And he's someone who is not looking to try and, as I say, lobby for the next pope, but to make it clear to everybody, Catholics and prelates alike, what's at stake. And he's well positioned to do that,
Yeah, he's aware, and that's what I love about it. He knows what the problems are. He knows that next pope, whenever that might be, 5-10 years, which is not long in the scheme of things, right? That he's got, these are the problems he's going to face, and looking at what we know from experience, what do we need the Pope to do? And yes, he's pontificating, but he knows the pontiffs better than probably any layperson, certainly in the English-speaking world, of which I'm aware. So if someone's going to pontificate on this particular issue, he's the man to do it.
How far, Joseph, were we supposed to have read for today?
It was just to the end of, well, they're not numbered, the pages, but the end of page 73, which is halfway through the book, basically.
Okay. All right. Because in the next chapter, we get into some concrete proposals as to what he thinks the Pope should do, which are pretty of consequence, don't you think? Well, but we can save that for next time.
It's like being someone that doesn't overexert myself, I only read as far as I was supposed to, so I'm looking forward to that in that case. But yes, I think we've had our half hour, and it's probably a good time.
Well, just a couple of points, maybe briefly, because we talked a lot about the chapter on the new evangelization. The next chapter 3, they're not numbered. The mistake we made is not numbering these as chapters. And each one very handily has a little thesis, under the chapter title, which is good. But on the next pope and the office of Peter, there's some kind of indirect criticism of Pope Francis there, I would say. But he makes a point which I've thought of myself often, that for many, many centuries, people didn't know who the Pope was. I mean, the ordinary person wouldn't even know who he was. But from the time of Pius IX in the mid-19th century, when the media began to expand, and it's been accelerating in radio and then television, and now social media. I mean, every time the Pope breathes, there's a tweet out on it or something.
Well, I think that you're right. Pius IX, of course, because the church has been persecuted. It's probably the first time in the non-Catholic world the Pope actually got a good press, because the Pope was the lesser of two evils. The French Revolution and those sort of ideas were much worse. But you're completely correct. And one of the dangers of St. John Paul II's success is that what was something singular to him, his charisma, his desire to travel and to evangelize and speak to huge crowds of people, sort of, if you like, sort of set the seal on what the Pope's supposed to be and do. And I would be more comfortable if that was seen as something which was one of the great charismatic gifts of St. John Paul II, and not something that the future popes don't have to be film stars. We don't have to look at every single thing they do and say, and argue about it. They in fact, up to a point, popes should be like Victorian children, seen and not heard.
Well, I think the more critical
That was a joke,
point,
by the way. That was a joke, by the way. Just because everyone take me the wrong way there.
Okay. Well, I think the more critical point, beyond just the volume and frequency of these utterances, I think a more serious point that Weigel's pointing to is on page 46, where he says, the imperative of papal self-discipline also suggests ending arrangements by which journalistic entities are permitted to claim that they are reflecting the mind of the Vatican. I think that has been a problem particular to this pontificate, and I'm not even going to point the finger necessarily at the Pope himself for having caused this, but the fact that he's a Jesuit, the fact that there are Jesuit publications and organs of communications and so on, this kind of thing has happened, and it's you lose control of your message.
Right. Well, it's inflation,
if other people start to...
It's inflation. If you're heard speaking too often, people stop listening, people stop taking it seriously anyway. So there's an inflationary thing here. What I call a law of diminishing returns. And on that actual page, Vivian, right at the top, this sums it up, the law of diminishing returns. The Pope can become a declining asset to the new evangelization if he speaks so often as to blunt the impact of what is really important for the bishops of Rome.
Right.
Right. And so he talks about papal protagonism, how the Pope becomes kind of the spear point and what good that can do. And it really can do good. But then the trade-off there's a negative thing, and a Pope has to be careful about that. And that's what he's saying for the next Pope. And then in chapter 4, we actually talked about chapter 5, the human person and Christian humanism, but we didn't say anything about chapter 4, the new Pope, the next Pope, and the fullness of Catholic faith. And there's also a couple of kind of not so veiled critiques of Pope Francis, because he says, for example, we can't be reductionists. We can't play off mercy against doctrine and so on, against truth. And that nowhere in the gospel are we given instructions on dialogue and accompaniment. That these can be good things, but they can't be, they're means, they're not the goal you're trying to achieve. So there's
and I love, Father, that in this, it's critique of what he calls Catholic light.
Yes.
As in Bud Light, right? The one's not beer and the other's not orthodoxy.
I love this line that in the not too distant future, Catholic light will lead to Catholic zero.
Yeah, excellent.
No calories. Well, this is good. So we'll finish the book next week, and the following week we hope to have George Weigel with us. Thanks, everybody. God bless you, and I'll see you next week. We'll see you next week.